Hello all, this is week 4, day 1. So we've just completed reading Hume, and rather than immediately switch into all the readings, all the various miscellaneous survey reading that we're going to do, I thought I'd start this week with a continuation of the prior week's materials, and this reading on Hume is in fact in the same book. It's in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and it's in some respects what you might think of as a sort of applied piece of work. So Hume has made these sorts of conclusions about the origin of all ideas. Ideas come from impressions, and impressions, of course, are the immediate experiences that we have, our momentary sense experience of what it's like to see red, or what it's like to feel love, or drink something that's hot, or all these sorts of things. So as a result of this sort of radical empiricism, or strong, I shouldn't say radical, maybe just strong empiricism, to claim that everything, all ideas come from experience, Hume derives certain results about things like miracles and religion. So I picked this reading because it's controversial and it's interesting. So maybe this will be some sort of fodder for a paper or some good reflective reading. In general, I don't expect this to change people's minds, but of course, as Vaughn initially suggested, we should do our readings with an open mind and at least try to comprehend the arguments, if only so that we can eventually reject them. But of course, if you're going to reject any of the conclusions that Hume draws, you sort of have some burden to try to give an explanation for why his arguments are inadequate. So, and that could be a great paper if you find this whole work to be faulty, and you can identify the reasons why. That's a good job. You've reasonably rejected an argument, as opposed to just sort of doing it as a gut reaction, which of course is not a reasonable thing to do, but it's a very customary thing to do. So with that sort of prelude, we'll just get into the material. So some of the things I just said are in fact redundant, so this will just kind of rehash the central points so that you have a firm understanding of Hume before we get into his application to the subject of miracles. So first and foremost, the best way to characterize Hume in general, if you just had two words to pick from, it would just be a skeptical empiricist. So Hume is skeptical. He's skeptical about religious claims and claims about miracles, but he's even skeptical about things we take that almost no one objects to, such as just causation itself, as we learn. So this empiricism, of course, is the claim that all knowledge is derived from the senses or sense experience, and this sort of manifests itself in the claim that all ideas are derived from impressions, right? So even relations of ideas at the end of the day are in some roundabout way a matter of impressions, because we get these ideas from impressions, and then only once we have these ideas can we manipulate them in various ways and draw out their relationships and sort of definitional features of them and that sort of thing. And a further point of reiteration is that all matters of fact are known through the senses. So he just said that, and that's just sort of a stipulation, but it also seems to conform to kind of a commonsensical view that we don't know anything that isn't a necessary truth without first investigating. So you can't know that bachelors are happy or unhappy, or any other sort of fact about the world at large, if you haven't looked around. And of course, these sorts of facts about the world aren't necessary. It's contingent. It's a contingent matter that, for example, the sun rises on a daily basis. It just so happens to be the way that our solar system is structured, and it could be otherwise. That's clear enough, right? So with this in mind, we have a better grasp on why Hume might be skeptical about certain sorts of things. So a famous quote that Hume employs is that he says, "A wise man therefore proportions his belief to the evidence." So if we have a belief in something, any sort of matter of fact about how the universe is, that belief can only reasonably be founded on sense experience, on some sort of impression that has been the result of an idea, which in turn we use towards constructing some sort of matter of fact. Without this sort of foundation, you don't really have anything to point to in terms of justifying why you hold a matter of fact to be true. So this holds even for cases of historical claims, and for Hume, this holds also for claims of miracles or religious claims more generally, that the only thing that can justify them is empirical evidence. So he says, even about experiments, that experimental evidence is a matter of probability. Experiments aren't necessary truths. It's just that a certain sort of correlation has happened a sufficient number of times, and therefore it's just really a matter of probability, and of course not necessity. In fact, he uses the term law of nature, but it's an interesting point to note that for Hume, he probably isn't committed to laws of nature in any strong sense. He uses the phrase because we all know it, but if you recall, for him, these sorts of things are just a matter of a sort of constant conjunction, and there's no underlying necessary connection, no causal nexus underpinning the fact that certain reactions happen consistently in the chemical world or whatever. So to call it a law of nature is to kind of presuppose that there's an underlying uniformity, whereas Hume only thinks that there's the visible, physical, contingent uniformity that we've happened to have experienced, and there's nothing more that we can refer to than the series of events that have in fact occurred. So to say that there's an underlying uniformity, that for example there's a law of nature or that there's some causal chain, that is a leap of inference, and that's not rationally justified. That's just a matter of custom or habit. So this same sort of thought applies even to eyewitness testimony. So what is eyewitness testimony? It's just sort of the same principle that we use ourselves in terms of using our sense experience, but it's this sense of experience of somebody else. So at the end of the day, the ultimate arbiter of eyewitness testimony is also experience. So it's not like there's some distinct principle that we should take the words of other people as just being true necessarily. It's really just they're using the same tools that we're using. We just weren't there to experience that particular thing. And so all the same rules are going to apply, that it's really just a matter of probability. There's nothing necessary binding it. And the only reason why we trust eyewitness testimony is because 9 out of 10 or whatever number you like, it just so happens that we can independently corroborate the evidence that the eyewitness claimed, right? So your roommate tells you there's still milk in the fridge or whatever, and then you can go check later on, and that's how you develop a sort of trust of these sorts of testimony. It's not, and it's just a feature of our sort of social cooperation, right? So it's not like we necessarily trust any witness just because they say so. We only trust it because in the past there has been this conjunction between what they say and what we later learn to be the case. So this has a very similar sort of symmetry with the case of our own sort of experience and the constant conjunction of one event and then the other event. So once again, it's just a matter of constant conjunction, and there's no underlying necessity, just an apparent uniformity that allows us to make these sort of inferences that, for example, event B will follow event A, or that this eyewitness is a reliable individual. But it's nothing necessary. It's just, and it can't be known independent of experience whether or not they're reliable. And so reasons, and this is just pretty commonsensical, reasons to distrust an eyewitness include witness contradictions, that there are few witnesses, the witness is of doubtful character, when there's an interest in their assertion. So for example, if somebody tells you, I was told that you should give me some significant portion of your income, and if you do that, you'll lead a much happier life. You might be skeptical because you know that the veracity of that claim is being interfered with by my sort of self-interest. And if somebody, this is kind of an interesting last one that Hume notes. He says if someone is too aggressive or too hesitant. So if someone, if you question an eyewitness or something like that, and they just try to shout over you, or they get mad and start insulting you, you might wonder if they have a good claim to truth or if they're just being overly defensive. And likewise, if you ask somebody what happened out there and they can't really clearly articulate what they saw and they're just kind of mumbling, you might also doubt them. But it seems like these aren't very clear criteria. They're just sort of rules of thumb. So all of these sorts of interference factors can undermine our trust in any sort of eyewitness account. And for Hume, of course, the only thing that's underpinning our belief in things like miracles is historical testimony, right? So somebody said they saw something and they wrote it in a book, and then we get this story, and so the thought is that maybe they saw something and then we're just relying on their testimony. So we have reason to not believe it if any of these factors prove to be relevant. And he provides more persuasive arguments as well. So after sort of doing this background, Hume directly confronts miracles as being something not worth believing in, and so the argument roughly goes like this. So miracles, by definition, are a violation of the laws of nature. So that's what it is to be a miracle. It's just, it's just miraculous, right? It's sometimes Hume doesn't say this, but sometimes it's thought of as God intervened in the situation and made something that was otherwise not possible or actual. So one problem with this sort of thing, a miracle being a violation of the laws of nature, is that by its own definition, it's putting itself at odds with all of our prior experience. So the argument against is all experience. So, a case of a miracle might be you put your hand into a fire and you just leave it there for 5 seconds and it's really roasting away, and then you pull your hand out and nothing happened to your hand. It's just fine. And there's clearly no, wrap on it or any sort of thing that would interfere with the fire. It was just a miracle. So this sort of situation has all of our prior experience of fire against it. So it's one instance against however many dozens of cases. So for that reason, because the arbiter in each case is experience, we have 1,000 trials versus one trial. And so in terms of the probability, the notion of experiment that Hume invoked earlier, we have reason to take the 1,000 cases over the one case. So that just seems to be a conceptual problem with miracles, that any case in which it's a miracle, it's going to be running contrary to the vast majority of cases. And then a second argument that isn't specifically invoked in section 1, and I'm only going to cover section 1, is that it's sort of a dilemma that Hume uses. So either a miracle occurred or I'm mistaken. Just as a rule of inference, he says we should infer the more probable scenario, and then he just stipulates it is more probable that I am mistaken than that the laws of nature were abridged. So again, it seems like it's just a similar rendition of the previous argument, that all things considered, it's more likely that I just had a mistaken perception than it really is the case that a cup was suspended in air with nothing touching it for, 10 seconds just in the exact same spot. So if you're going to believe one or the other, and because neither one is a necessary truth, they're all a matter of experience and a posteriori, you should just take the more probable one. And the more probable one is the one that's in conformity with past experience. And we also know that our own sense experience can be at fault. We've made mistakes in judgment or in perception before, but never before, I'm assuming, has any of us seen a miracle. So if you do happen to see a single miracle, the more reasonable result is to assume that in this single instance you're mistaken. Now, if it happens over and over again, there's one or two things. Either A, it's not a miracle, right? Because a miracle is by definition a violation of the laws of nature. So if it's a regular occurrence, then you're not even talking about a miracle. You're just talking about a cool natural phenomenon. And then B, if it happens frequently enough, it's not a miracle anymore. But also, you have reason to believe it. So Hume isn't just categorically opposed to anything spectacular happening. If people started coming alive from the dead on a regular basis, and there was enough people to sort of verify this occurrence, there seems to be no reason in principle why Hume couldn't just jump on board and say, sure, but this isn't a miracle anymore because it's apparently not a violation of the laws of nature. It's a regular occurrence within nature. So that's a quick rundown. One thing is that I don't want to be dogmatic about this sort of thing. That would be the worst thing to do in this sort of instance. So I want to provide two possible rebuttals. This could also be some more intellectual fodder for you if you want to do sort of back and forth a dialectic on this issue. So there's two possible points of rebuttal as I see it. At least two. This is probably not an exhaustive list. So the first one is that you might attack the premise of radical skepticism. So for one thing, Hume is very particular in his claim that all ideas are derived from impressions and that the only thing that could justify a miracle or belief in a miracle is the experience of it or something like that. But on the other hand, you might think that there are other ways to justify these sorts of things in terms of rational argumentation. So you might take the precedent of a rationalist like Descartes as a sort of model that could show on other grounds why miracles are worth believing in. So, as you recall, Descartes is a rationalist, so our knowledge of the world can be derived through reason alone, and it's not just limited to sense experience. And what this entails is that we might have reason to believe in something like a miracle if we can construct a sufficiently rigorous argument from reason and not relying so much on sense experience. So it seems like if you're just sort of casually reflecting in your mind, you can think, well, I can imagine a miracle occurring, and if I can imagine a miracle, then it seems like it's possible, and if it's possible in a sufficiently large universe, there's somewhere in which this sort of miracle is actual. So what I'm doing here is kind of a rendition of Descartes' argument for God, in which the thought there is that if we have an idea of something such as perfection or God, the only place that idea could come from is the thing itself, right? There must be some actual thing underpinning that. But this argument that I'm using is slightly different. The idea here is that take the whole massive universe, and consider that there's no contradiction underpinning the idea of a miracle. As a matter of fact, it's contingent. It's perfectly conceivable that a cup could float in space or something, or somebody could put their hand in to a fire and not get burnt. And with such a massive universe, it seems like at some point, somewhere, it's perfectly possible that the laws of nature could be suspended, that they could just not occur. And so, although maybe no one's ever personally experienced, so it's not an argument from experience, it seems at least conceptually possible that such an occurrence could have occurred. So that's one route, that the radical empiricism is too restrictive, and that we can use reasoning to try to come about a different means of justifying at least the reasonable possibility of a miracle at some point. So if that interests you, review that argument, because I didn't write down all of the details, but there might be something worthwhile there. The second thought that might be interesting is that, so in a sense, you might think that what Hume is doing is a sort of straw man incognito. So what I mean by that is that Hume sort of presupposes that claims of miracles are intended to be fact-stating, just like other sorts of empirical claims are intended to be fact-stating. So take the claim that the world is spherical, and then take the claim that, I don't know, I stuck my hand in a fire, or someone stuck their hand in a fire and left it there, and this was a cleansing act for all of humanity, or something like that. So in the one case, you think they're the spherical, that's a fact-stating claim. In the second case, you might also think that that's also a fact-stating claim, but you could also interpret this sort of thing not as a statement, but just sort of as a sort of parable, as a way of kind of reaffirming a culture, a sense of identity, a way of life. And in that sense, he's kind of arguing, he's misconstruing claims about miracles as being empirical scientific claims, when in fact they're just kind of reaffirming traditions, or expressing certain sorts of feelings of community solidarity or hope about our life and the future, of goodwill towards one another. So in that second sense, if a better way of interpreting claims about miracles is just in this sort of non-fact stating way, then it seems like we can make sense of miracles and not have this result that says, oh, it's not rational to believe in miracles. Because at the end of the day, the purpose of talking about miracles is not to convince other people of facts about the way the universe really is. It's a matter of expressing a feeling, or talking about a certain sort of way of life, or conveying cultural expression. So that's the second thought. If that one interests you, I could maybe suggest some other reading, or any number of things, or we could talk about it. So hopefully that gives you something to think about, and yeah, I'll talk to you next time. And of course, ask questions or leave comments or talk to me on the chat room. And thank you for your time.